Let me tell you something that should trouble you deeply, yet empower you if you heed it correctly. We stand at a moment in history when the long-term debt cycle, the grand arc that shapes empires, currencies, and societies, is breaking. This is not hyperbole, it's a historical pattern repeating itself with increasing ferocity. When debt balloons and governments suppress interest burdens with money printing, the result is monetary devaluation, and once that happens, most assets lose their value. Everyone trusts in fiat currencies, bonds, equities until they all collapse, but gold endures. Seize that truth. Recognize it. Because right now, 99.9% of people are exposed. They'll lose their assets. Why? Because they failed to understand that gold is not someone else's liability. It is not a promise written on paper. It is a safe harbor tethered to value across centuries. This long-term debt cycle is textbook. It began when the world adopted fiat currencies and abandoned hard money. In the decades that followed, especially post-Bretton Woods, the US dollar became the global reserve currency. But all that changed as deficits grew and debt claims far outstripped real storeholds of value. When that happens, people realize the promises they've relied on, promises of stability, of guarantees, are no longer viable. They rush to preserve their purchasing power, and what they cling to is something intrinsic, something that cannot be printed: gold. I've studied this across hundreds of years, across systemic breakdowns, and each time the lesson is the same. When the confidence in money fails, gold is the only reliable refuge. Today, all the warning signs are flashing. The US, like many Western economies, is trapped in a debt doom loop. We are borrowing more than ever. We are spending 40% more than we collect in revenue. Interest payments alone are enormous. And borrowing continues, forcing central banks to step in with more money printing. This is classic pressure. This is the buildup of an economic heart attack. The only natural reaction to that is the devaluation of money. Look back to history, 1920s, 1930s, 1970s. Whenever this dynamic accelerates, the flight is always toward hard assets. Gold stands alone. It is not somebody else's liability. It is real, finite, historically proven. So let's talk about what you should do as an investor, as a guardian of your wealth. I recommend having about 10 to 15% of your portfolio in gold, possibly coupled with a small position in Bitcoin if you're inclined. But I strongly prefer gold. That allocation is not excessive. It's not speculative, it is insurance. If you're aiming to optimize return to risk as neutral as possible, you'd hold about 15% combined in gold and Bitcoin. Personally, I stick more with gold. It's the purest store of value. It's proven. It doesn't rely on code or networks that can be surveilled or shut down. Beyond that, any strategic framework like the all-weather portfolio allocates around 7.5% to gold, complemented by another 7.5% in broader commodities, which together represent the hard assets bucket. And by design, this portfolio balances stocks, bonds, inflation hedges, and hard assets to perform across inflation and deflation, growth and contraction. What matters is understanding diversification alongside cycles. You don't invest emotionally, you don't chase headlines. You prepare in proportion to risk. A well-balanced portfolio acknowledges that fiat assets are vulnerable in times like these. You hedge. You own a slice of gold because it brings balance. It cushions against volatility. It minimizes loss when everything else shrinks. Look, central banks and governments will always choose to print money over political pain. They'll inflate their way out of trouble because they must. And that's precisely why fiat currencies lose purchasing power. Gold doesn't. You may think, why not pick other hard assets like real estate, agriculture, industrial metals? Well, maybe they too can serve as hedges. But gold is universal, global, liquid, and discrete. It doesn't rely on infrastructure or contracts or jurisdiction. It has survived every empire's collapse. It's not contrived. It doesn't fail. That's why central banks hold it. That's why sovereigns depend on it. Yes, Bitcoin is novel and fascinating. It has scarcity, it has global reach, but its track record is short. Governments can regulate or restrict it. Its behavioral dynamics are less tested in crisis. Gold is tested. Gold is proven. That said, if you want a small speculative position in Bitcoin, fine, but do not consider Bitcoin a substitute for gold. It is a companion, not the anchor. Now think beyond the mechanics. Think philosophically. Gold embodies freedom. It transcends crisis. It preserves value regardless of politics or policy. And in times of upheaval, it's your quiet ally. When others panic, gold stands firm. When they lose confidence in currency, gold endures. As an investor, you must internalize that principle. Picture this: when currency collapses or inflation roars, bonds default or are printed away, equities crumble, real assets falter under volatility. But gold retains. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't require faith. It just is, and that certainty is invaluable. So here's the urgency. If you are exposed without gold, you are exposed to systemic risk. Your wealth is not immune. Most people assume their savings, pensions, stocks, bonds will ride the wave, but they won't. They will erode. They will annihilate when the system shifts. You must anticipate. You must allocate. You must hedge with gold. Gold is not your entire portfolio. You still invest in stocks for growth, bonds for income, inflation-linked securities, global equities. But your exposure to hard assets is your ballast. You hedge against extreme outcomes because they happen. They always have. Let me close with this: history is your teacher. Heavy debt, political fracturing, money printing, they culminate inevitably in devaluation and loss of trust. The question is, are you prepared, or are you part of the 99.9% caught flat-footed when Fayette falters? You have the knowledge now, you have the data, you see the cycle, you understand the rational allocation. Act before the wave arrives, not after. Protect what matters. Preserve your purchasing power. Hold gold as your anchor, not because you fear the future, but because you respect the lessons of history. That is timeless wisdom. Let me talk plainly, as I would to someone seeking not just a quick win, but a durable understanding of how economies and wealth behave over time. We are entangled in the late stages of a long-term debt cycle, the kind that shapes centuries, not just months. It unfolds gradually, under our awareness, like a slow building pressure that eventually must release. When you understand this cycle, you begin to see how easy it is to be blindsided when system-wide imbalances have reached critical mass. Most people don't perceive the buildup until it's too late. They trust that money, assets, and financial constructs will hold. But they're often built on liabilities, promises, not real value. And when those promises fail or get devalued, those assets collapse. That is what 99.9% will lose their gold and assets. Means in practical terms, not because they were irresponsible, but because they didn't reflect on the rules governing money, credit, debt, and cycles. Look back to the foundations. Money began not with paper, but with metals that held intrinsic value: gold, silver. It was portable, negotiable across borders, and not dependent on someone else's promise. In every major regime change or economic breakdown, from empires to modern states, gold remains because it is not someone else's liability. It is itself. That's the core principle. When promises fail, tangible fundamentals endure. Without that understanding, one puts faith in constructs that can disappear. Over time, societies became comfortable with fiat money, government-issued currencies not anchored to intrinsic value. That worked until it didn't. It worked until debt amassed so heavily, until trust eroded, until the machinery of promises exceeded the capacity to honor them. At that point, history shows the only stable value turns back towards something tangible: gold. We are now deep in that phase of imbalance. The pressure is real across global economies, including the United States and the UK. Debt burdens have exploded. Governments are spending tens of percent more than they collect in revenue, financing deficits with borrowing, and central banks printing money. This is not hypothetical. It's not academic. It defines our economic moment. It is the classic setup of a debt doom loop, a cycle of dependency that erodes faith in currency and in system stability. From an investment standpoint, there are three pragmatic actions to take. First, always view your portfolio in inflation-adjusted terms. Nominal growth might look good, but if inflation is rampaging, you're losing value. Second, hold a portion, around 10 to 15% of your assets in true non-liability money, namely gold, may be paired with a small position in something like Bitcoin if you choose. But gold should be your anchor, time-tested, historically resilient. Third, use inflation-protected instruments like TIPS, Treasury inflation, protected securities in the US, because they guard against the stealth tax of inflation. These three form a triage system when systems are under stress. Why 10 to 15%? Because it's not speculative, It's prudent. It's insurance. If hypothetically you aim for the most efficient risk to return allocation, holding that much in gold or gold plus a modest amount of crypto provides a buffer against currency devaluation. It doesn't consume your portfolio, but it sets a guardrail. In a world where central banks print to stave off collapse, protecting your purchasing power becomes mission critical. Some may ask, why not more hard assets like real estate or commodities? They're valid options, and diversification is meaningful. But gold is unique. It's universally recognized, globally liquid, discrete, not encumbered by contracts or physical limitations. It doesn't require jurisdiction, maintenance, or counterparties. It simply is. Now, I don't want this to sound like fear-mongering. It's not. It's acknowledgement of how systems function. There will always be cycles of expansion and contraction, of gain and reversion. The value lies not in guessing perfectly what's next, but in designing a resilient approach so that when disruptions occur, the system, your portfolio, can absorb and pivot. That's the discipline of diversification, of hedging, of respecting cycles. You might wonder, why has gold risen so significantly in this period? Because we are seeing the stress reflected in price. Gold's climb is not arbitrary, it's a signal. Just as price moves reflect underlying supply and demand, increased gold prices reflect shifting investor psychology. Trust in fiat is ebbing, and demand for real value is rising. You don't want to be late to that story. Let me also speak to Bitcoin, not because it's core to this, but because some of you will ask. Bitcoin has certain attractive traits: scarcity, censorship resistance, programmable, but it's untested in systemic panic. Governments can restrict it. Markets can collapse its value. It's valuable, but not yet proven as a universal store of value. That's why gold remains foundational. If you wish to hold a small stake in alternatives, fine, but always anchor your portfolio with gold. That's rational, disciplined humility. All of this is rooted in the study of history, how debt crises unfold, how monetary systems shift, how power rearranges. We shouldn't pretend that history repeats exactly, but it rhymes. Every debt crisis follows a template: excessive leverage, surging money supply, falling trust, collapsing currency, flight to safe assets. Knowing that pattern isn't pessimism, it's readiness. So, to you now at this precipice, I say you can be among those who suffer and lose, or those who recognize the signals and adapt. Understanding long-term debt cycles, seeing the erosion of fiat, respecting the endurance of hard money, that's the differential. It's what keeps you grounded during chaos. It lets you say, I'm not fearful, I'm prepared. If you ask how to start, begin small. Reallocate 10-15% of your portfolio toward gold. Add types or equivalent inflation-protected instruments. Hold the rest diversified across growth and income assets. In time, reassess as markets and cycles evolve, but don't dismiss this now. When trust falters, value endures. Why is all of this urgent? Because the excesses of policy, of borrowing, of rhetoric cannot continue forever. They expand until they can't. And when they break fast. History is full of examples where cycles turned quickly, where asset holders were caught under sudden shifts. Don't let that be you. In truth, investing is not about chasing upside, it's about avoiding ruin. And in tumultuous times, preserving value becomes as powerful as generating return. Gold serves as the counterpart to promise-based assets. It balances optimism with pragmatism. It reminds you that while financial constructs matter, they ultimately rest on human trust, and trust can fail. So take this as a moment to test your approach, not for alarm, but for resilience. Rebalance rationally. Prepare prudently. Understand cycles. Honor history. Preserve, don't panic. And when markets convulse, know that your wealth is not just surviving, but that you are anchored, patient, and informed. That is the core of strategic investing, and why most will fail, because they don't see it as precautionary, only as reactive. But knowing how the machine works, investing accordingly, and holding non-liability money, that's how one stays solvent when others panic. Let me begin by inviting you to see the world not as a collection of disconnected events, but as a grand pattern, a machine operating through cycles that are both inevitable and instructive. We find ourselves deep into a long-term debt cycle, one that spans decades, not days. These cycles begin in times of low debt and hard money, when money has intrinsic value and credit is limited. Over time, credit grows. Governments borrow, banks issue claims. That system works until it doesn't. When debt becomes too expansive, when central banks have no more levers to pull, when interest rates are at zero and printing fails to stimulate real activity. At that point, the system begins to buckle. This is precisely where we stand now. We are looking at the end game of an 80-year cycle that began post-World War II and set the stage for today's monetary system. History teaches us that when debt piles up in monetary stimulus ends up inflating assets rather than producing real economic growth. People's confidence in money and credit, these are promises, erodes. They begin to shift their wealth towards something real, something non-liability, gold, because gold is not a promise. It is not someone else's IOU. It is real. It is portable. We're now witnessing this stress across major economies. In the U.S., government revenues are around $5 trillion, while expenditures tally $7 trillion, with interest alone eating another trillion. That creates acute pressure, a financial heart attack, if you will. Nations like the UK and France are similarly trapped, with debt approaching or exceeding 100% of GDP. Political dysfunction leaves no room for real solutions. Instead, borrowing continues to, in such scenarios, investing in government bonds becomes a risky proposition. Promises made with weakening currency under mounting fiscal pressure, they're dangerous. Instead, history shows gold shines. In times of crisis, gold outperforms bonds by an average of 71%. This is not speculation. This is structural resilience. So what are the practical steps? First, always measure your portfolio in real terms, not nominal. Inflated numbers can be seductive until inflation erodes real value. Second, invest roughly 10 to 15% of your portfolio in gold. It's not for speculative gain, but for robust diversification and preservation of purchasing power. It's insurance. Third, complement that with Treasury inflation-protected securities, IPOs or equivalents for steady real returns above inflation. These are not alarmist choices. They are rational responses to systemic risk. When debt is high and monetary authorities run out of options, inflation becomes their default tool. That devalues liabilities, but gold stands firm. It becomes the logical destination for capital seeking safety. It isn't perfect. For long periods, its real returns can be poor. But when financial chaos erupts, gold's inverse correlation with bonds and cash becomes invaluable. Yes, some talk about gold versus Bitcoin. Bitcoin has attractive features: scarcity, digital reach, censorship resistance, but it's unproven in systemic upheaval. Governments can and might restrict it. Gold isn't dependent on code or consensus. It survived empires, wars, monetary shifts, the times. Use crypto if you want as a speculative hedge, but your foundation should be gold. This all stems from understanding the long-term debt cycle. It starts in hard money systems, moves through credit expansion, then into fiat, culminating in debt saturation and stimulus failure, then defaults, restructuring, devaluation. At the end, trust collapses and gold reascends as the safe storehold of wealth. That cyclical arc is not theory. It is history. So what separates those who lose from those who maintain? Awareness and preparation. Most don't see where the cycle stands until it's too late. They feel comfortable until that comfort is crushed. The paradox: proximity to collapse breeds complacency. That's when systemic fragility is greatest. Meanwhile, those who recognize cycles prepare. They diversify, they allocate prudently, they own gold, not to bet on gloom, but to honor the mechanical tensions of money, credit, and debt. By positioning hump of 15% in gold, balancing the rest across growth and inflation hedges, using types, and maintaining disciplined diversification, you create a portfolio that can adjust rather than fracture. When fiat falters, your real wealth stands. That is strategic investing, not speculative gambling. Survival and preservation, not panic. And let me be clear, this is not about fearing the future. It's about respecting the dynamics of history. Understand money and credit. Recognize how they sculpt economic and political landscapes. That insight lets you behave, not react. That is at the essence of good investing. It's principles over predictions. So you stand at a fork, do nothing, and risk being swept away in the next downturn. Or allocate rationally, anticipate, diversify, anchor with gold, hedge inflation, respect cycles. That's not fear, it's foresight. When debt restructuring arrives, and history says it will, you'll be ready. Others won't. You must choose. Protect your wealth, not because chaos is certain, but because prudence is timeless.